We're moving to the next section with General Stanley McChrystal, who I don't think needs a lot of introduction to the people in this room, but the commander of JSOC and also ISAF commander, and also a prolific author who has a new book on character, which you'll be prepared to sign after this event. And I'm going to interview him right now. General McChrystal, first of all, congratulations on the book, which I thought was incredibly well written. In short, declarative, easy to understand sentences. And, well, I mean, people undervalue, I mean, why do we still read Gibbon? Because he wrote in English that is still readable 2 centuries later. But so what was the main message of the book that you were trying to communicate? And obviously we live in, President Trump doesn't appear in the book, and I know that's a specific choice, but this seems a moment where the question of character is kind of on people's minds.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And thanks everybody being here. We've been on a first name basis for 15 years, and today he's calling me General. So there's something that worries me a little bit. Yeah. This was the last book. I wasn't going to write this book. I'd written a few other books, and you're done. And then I was disturbing. Annie and I sit in the living room and read at night, my wife, and we've been married 48 years. And every few minutes I would stop and I'd go, Annie, let me tell you what I think about issue X. And she nods. And then after a while she said, hey, just write this stuff down. Meaning don't interrupt her. And so I started writing these 800 to 1,000 word essays, which is a really interesting process because it's on every subject that I was thinking about. And the original title was going to be What I Think About the Things I Think About, which I thought was great. Annie thought it was stupid. Publishers thought it was stupid. But what happened was a couple of dynamics. First is when you write 800 to 1,000 words on an issue, you find out you don't think what you thought you did about that issue. Like you say, pick one. Is it good to lie, cheat, and steal? And so I asked somebody that, and they go, no, it's not. Then you got to write 800 to 1,000 words, and you have to make an argument to yourself that is convincing to you. And in that process, you find your thinking is much, or at least I found my thinking was much more nuanced than I thought. In many cases, my actual conclusions were different than I might have given in a snap answer on something. So I started writing these, and they became very cathartic, and they became very, I'm 71, so I'm at that point in life where you try to put everything in some kind of focus. And we found out in the process that what I was writing about was character. They all intersected in some ways about character, because that's what I've been thinking about. That's what I've been concerned about. That's what I've decided is the most important thing and always was. You have that point in your life where you're trying to get educated and start a career and become competent and become respected, and other things are more important. And they'd say, well, what about character? Yeah, it's important too, but I got to learn how to do X. And then you find out the thing you needed to learn most was on character. And you go back to who the people you respect most, who are your closest friends, whatnot. It always comes back to your respect, or at least in my case, that your respect for their character. So the book suddenly became clear to me that that's what I wanted to talk about. And the purpose of the book is not to sell a lot of books. The purpose of the book is to start a national conversation on character, and not, on Capitol Hill, but to start it in churches, around dinner tables, in classrooms, and get people saying, this is what we think character is. This is what we want it to be. And this is what we're willing to demand it be of ourselves and of other people. And so it became a work of sort of passion to try to communicate that.
I think at one point you define character, I think partly through Marcus Aurelius, So what is character?
Yeah. Character is who we are. It's the essence of us. Thomas Paine, of course, the famous pamphleteer, said reputation is what men think of us. Character is what gods and angels know of us.
Hmm.
Now, ultimately, character is measured by what you do, not by what you say, not by what you write. It's what you do. So you can protest all the things you want. You can even think you've got character a certain way. But in moments where it is tested, you'll find out what your character is. I came out with a mathematical equation for it because I was trained as an engineer, not a competent one, but an engineer. And so I think character are your convictions, your deeply held beliefs. Those are the things you've thought about, not just accepted. They're the things you're willing to live to or potentially die for, times the discipline you have to live up to it. Because you can have all the great convictions in the world, but if you don't have the discipline or the courage to live up to them, they mean nothing, because anything times zero is zero. And so I think that the two are almost co-equal, because who we decide to be is tested on a constant basis.
You open your book with a very testing moment for you personally. What was that, and how did you deal with it?
I can't remember now. Some of you will remember very well. I'd been in the Army a little more than 34 years, and an article came out in Rolling Stone magazine titled "A Runaway General." This is not a good title. And I'd been in command in Afghanistan for a little more than a year, and a freelance reporter working a story for the Rolling Stone wrote a story about my command team that made us look like a locker room and immature and not respectful to the president and vice president. I don't think it was accurate. I don't think it was fair, but it doesn't matter. The article came out, and I'm responsible. And this article ends up on the desk of my boss, the commander-in-chief, President Obama. And for those of you who remember, the summer of 2010, President Obama was still relatively early in his presidency. And there was this backdrop, this narrative of pressure or tension between the Department of Defense and the new administration, between the generals and a young president. Now, whenever anyone who knows close enough to know, there's no such thing as the generals. We don't hang out together. It's not this group of people who agree. But the point is, there was this perception. It really came out of Iraq. I mean, it built up over time, and it came out of Iraq. And so there's this background, and then this article comes up that sort of tests general who doesn't respect the leadership. Now, I voted for President Obama. I was an ardent supporter. But the point is, it comes up. So I flew back to the United States with my resignation to offer it to the president, and went into the Oval Office. Short professional conversation. We always got along, still do. And he accepted my resignation. So here I am. I'd been born in an Army hospital. I'd gone to West Point at age 17, and now I'm 55, about to be 56. All I'd ever done is be a soldier. All I'd ever wanted to do was be a soldier. And now I was in this command job. Always thought I could get fired, thought I could get killed, thought, anything could happen. But I never thought I'd be questioned about my loyalty and judgment. But boom, it happens. So in an instant, I walk out of the Oval Office, and I'm not the commander anymore. I'm not a general anymore. I'm not even a soldier anymore. And so then the question is, what am I? And you don't have that deep a thought in the moment, but it's like this swirling, disorienting thing. And of course, you're trained to be stoic, so you don't show that. You stand up straight and walk. And I've got my military assistant, another guy with me, and we get in the car to drive back across D.C. I'd flown all night to get in for this meeting, but my wife was living at Fort McNair, and I'd been gone 6 of the previous 7 years, and I'd just come back, just finishing a year, and I drive across the city, And Annie's waiting there. And the chairman had called her and said, he's going to see the president, and I think it's going to be okay. But Annie, she's a big girl. She could read. And so I walk into the house and I go, Annie, it's over. President accepted my resignation. And she's standing there and she goes, good. And then she goes, we've always been happy and we'll always be happy. It was an extraordinary moment. Because in that moment, what she did, and I don't know if she did it reflexively or I don't know if she thought through it, she set the azimuth for the future. Because she said, we're not going to be a bitter old general and his wife complaining about it. We're not going to relitigate this. We're not going to do any of that stuff. We're going to point in a new direction and we're going to go there. And I joke with people that Annie lives life like she drives with no use for the rearview mirror, which is a good thing. But the point being is, everybody hits something in life where you fail. And I could get you aside and say, it wasn't my fault. I was a victim. It doesn't matter. I failed. I didn't finish my job. And for every 30 seconds for the next 48 hours, I'm on the ticker of the news. And if you haven't had that experience, it's painful. My 86-year-old father's watching it down in Tennessee. My son down in college is watching it. All the people you care about are watching it. And you can't stand up and go, no, it's not. It is the reality at the moment, and you have to deal with it. And so it gave me an opportunity that I describe here to sort of not just introspection, but circumspection, kind of go around myself and decide who I want to be, who I was, but more importantly, who I want to be. And so a lot of the things in the book are sort of about trying to figure that out.
Have you ever thought about the person that you might have become if that had not happened to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I don't think I'd have thought as much, meaning I think I was planning to do 2 more years in the Army. I was planning to stay 3 years in Afghanistan and then likely retire, but you don't know. But I don't think I would have been forced into deciding what I wanted to be. Clearly, when this moment forced me to reset. And so for the last 15 years, I've done this series of things, all of which have worked out really well, just by luck in many cases. Started a business, written a number of books, taught at Yale for 12 years, been on some boards, made friends that, I knew, but I didn't really have deeply before. I've just had this unbelievable string of lucky events, but I don't think I'd have gotten that. I think I'd have eased out of the Army kind of normally. And so in some ways, and I don't wish this happened, but Annie and I talk about it as sometimes the best thing that ever happened to us.
General, when I read My Share of the Task, and when I read My Share of the Task, which is General McChrystal's account of JSOC during the Iraq War, it was deeply surprising to me because this was a whole part of the war that we just had not been told about. I mean, there were a lot of books about the conventional part of the war, but there was this secret war. And I mean, and to take us back to that moment in time, I think JSOC itself was so secret that people didn't even really know it existed almost. Now, I mean, for a variety of things we know about it. But when you sat down to write that book, what was the intent? Because I think you rewrote the history of the Iraq War, at least for people like myself who were paying attention.
Yeah, I wasn't going to write any book because I just didn't. And then they said, you have a debt to history. And I said, I don't have a debt to history. And they said, we'll pay you a lot of money. And I said, all right, let's write this book. And of course, this is from a community that is secret. And so I went to our headquarters and I said, what do you guys think? Do you want me to write this book? And I was told, yeah, we want you to write the book. but we want you to obviously follow all security things, which we did scrupulously. And several things happened. First is you have to understand JSOC. It was formed after the failure of the Iran rescue mission in 1980. And it was the U.S. military and the government to give us a counterterrorist capability, which we didn't have before that. And it was lavishly funded, and it got specially selected people. And I remember when I first joined it, I was a young major. We're at Fort Bragg, and we are secret, which is cool. We wore civilian clothes. Now, we're the only people at Fort Bragg in civilian clothes, so I don't know how much the secrecy worked. But anyway, it's a collection of this really good people with literally unlimited priority, and we could get things done and whatnot. So it was an extraordinary group, and it matured really effectively through Grenada, Panama, first Gulf War. Not perfectly. I mean, there were always bumps and grinds and mistakes made and whatnot, but it came in to be the best counterterrorist force in the world by a lot. I mean, you can read what you want about other countries. I worked with all of them, and I would tell you there's no comparison. And that started pretty early. And so JSOC became this extraordinarily effective force, really focused on counter hijacking, hostage rescue, very precise raids. It's grown in capability and spectrum now, but that was sort of the reason for being in the early years. And I got a chance to grow up inside it. I was a ranger, but I was also on the JSOC staff and whatnot. And so it was this really great place to be, much less bureaucracy, really high priority, and, kind of a get things done mentality. We got into, after 9/11, and JSOC went to Afghanistan first, initial operations, then largely reduced forces, then went into Iraq early, and then largely reduced forces. So when I took over in October 2003, we were down to very small entities in both of those locations, with the idea that we would sort of turn this over to all the conventional forces, and we would stay back in the U.S. and we would surge forward as required. And I take over in October, and Iraq is starting to circle the drain. If any of you go back and check the timelines, invasion in March looks real easy. Saddam Hussein falls pretty quickly. Have about 6 weeks of honeymoon when the Iraqi people are sort of patient, be getting frustrated with no power, no pensions. Made some big mistakes. Disbanded the army, disbanded the Ba'ath Party, or put them in the penalty box, and we lost the Iraqi population if we would have ever had it. But we lost it by late summer. You're starting to get resistance by people just shooting RPGs, and there's ammunition everywhere, so it's easy to create improvised explosive devices. And then in August and September, you have these initial terrorist attacks on the Jordanian Embassy, United Nations headquarters. And we realized that there is something different going on. There's not just a bunch of irritated Iraqis, and it's not a bunch of old chain-smoking Saddam's generals. They were kind of irrelevant. It was a group of terrorists who were getting themselves organized under a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, ultimately became al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were the existential threat. Everything else was noise. They were the signal, and they were the thing that was going to kill the endeavor. And that became obvious just about the time I was named the commanding general of JSOC, October. I didn't recognize it. We sort of stumbled upon that pretty quickly after, but suddenly would become, and it's a completely different war than we thought it was. I'd been back in the Pentagon for the previous year and watching this thing from afar. And when I got over to Iraq in October, I was stupefied with a couple of things. One, the situation was already getting worse than it seemed. And second, we were so freaking disorganized. I mean, I went into the green zone in Baghdad, and you had people trying to do functions on 30-day rotations. Good people would be sent over for 30 days to set up the Iraqi police or to set up the Iraqi stock exchange. And 2 weeks is finding out where they lived and, that kind of stuff. And so it was a recipe to not be effective. But the idea was we were going to get out as quick as we could, and the Iraqis were going to take over. But we had torn apart their army and, done some things. So it very quickly got obvious that we were going to have a much bigger problem than we thought we were. By the end of the year, when we captured some intelligence right after Christmas, it was clear that Al-Qaeda in Iraq hadn't adopted that name yet, but they soon would, was a real thing, and that they were going to be a big, big problem. And so JSOC, I started focusing this secret entity. I started bringing more forces over. We started standing up task forces, but we were still immature. We hadn't done this kind of operation at scale. We're starting to put it together. And then right at the end of the winter, Fallujah melts down. And I think you remember there were some U.S. contractors who were killed and then burned. And it was sort of a shock treatment to wake up for the people over there to go, okay, this is going to get really ugly really quickly. And it sort of got uglier over the next few years. At JSOC, our primary role was against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But there were some associated other entities. There were a lot of other security challenges in the country, but we were across the whole country and actually across the entire region. We were designed and tasked to destroy that. And so I stayed in command 5 years. And that's what we did for 5 years. And most of the same operators, literally on rotations, did it the whole time.
And you turned it, I think it was doing 2 raids a month or 4 raids a month into doing 300 raids a month, so 10 a night.
Right.
So the scale of this thing became... Gettysburg has played a very important role in your life. Why is that?
Yeah, everybody's got a place, and I wasn't in the Battle of Gettysburg as old as I look. But I've always been an enthusiast for history, so I like to read it and whatnot. My father took me to Gettysburg right after he came back from Vietnam on his first tour. And we had to go up and bury his brother-in-law, my uncle, who had died, who was a veteran, so there's military. And so we went up to coordinate that, but my father took the opportunity to show me the battlefield. And I was 11, I think, at the time. And so I remember I also grew of age just during the centennial of the Civil War, so it was a big thing when I was younger. But then I took my leaders when I was commanding the Ranger Regiment in 1999. I took them there. We did an offsite for a couple of days, and it turned out to be a really good place to think about leadership, not to study the tactics, but because there were a lot of big leadership decisions made. And then during the war in 2005, I brought the commanders from JSOC, most of them forward deployed, back to the States, and we went to Gettysburg to do an offsite and focus. Some interesting things happened. The first thing was Marcus Luttrell and his patrol got whacked in Kunar province in Afghanistan. And we were not running that operation, but one of the helicopters that got shot down going in for the relief was ours, because we've been asked to provide that from the 160th. And so we ran the rest of the relief operation from the second floor of the Gettysburg Hotel using long distance communications. Second thing, as I was told that I had to go down to the White House to explain what we were doing about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq. And I had come back and I didn't have my uniform, I didn't have a dress uniform. And so I had to get my guys to bring up a dress uniform, fly by helicopter the next morning down to DC and go brief the president on what we were doing. And so it was an opportunity to cause us all to reflect and focus. Now, we'd already been in the war for a couple of years at that point. And so people were pretty seasoned. The commanders, we'd known each other, most of us, for a lifetime. But we turned out to be in it for several more years together. So I've still got some photographs of that gathering. And Bill McCraven and many of the people that you know are in that, Scotty Miller and whatnot, as we came together. And it was the maturing of an organization. We were really at the tipping point from being something that was coming together to being something that had now been fighting together for more than 2 years, become this machine you described. and then our spouses are there with us, because the way this war worked is you mailed your dead and wounded home. And so they came home and your spouses were back there visiting people in the hospital and going to Arlington for ceremonies and whatnot, because much of the force stayed. And so they were a much more organic part of it than I think some people might have guessed.
You know, your father was in the military. He was a general in Vietnam. Your son also served in other capacity. I'm writing a history of the war on terror, and it's striking to me how many of the generals' sons and daughters fought and have fought in the war, which A, shows the longevity of the fight, but B, gets to this kind of question of having a hereditary military. I think 80% of people in the military have a close relative. So are you concerned about that? Because obviously in Korea, it was a draft, or Vietnam, that kind of puts a wall.
Yeah, I don't think it's entirely healthy. I would go fly around Afghanistan and visit bases with small American units, usually paired with Afghan forces, and invariably one of the NCOs or officers there was the son or daughter of somebody I served with. I knew a lot of them in high school. You know, when they were high school kids, I'd run into them. I went to one place and there was a young private there, and he's got a name tag on. His name was Longmire, and I looked at him and I go, his father had been first a Ranger NCO and then a Delta Force NCO, was killed under my command in Iraq about a year and a half before. And you see now, you know, the generations coming. And it's good from the standpoint of you almost know the lineage for everybody, and there's a strength to it. There's a weakness in that it can be insulated. You know, during the Vietnam War, and most of you will know this, I think there were 100 and some sons and daughters of general officers and flag officers killed in Vietnam. There wasn't a single son or daughter of a congressman or senator, not one. I don't know if there's a similar number for Afghanistan and Iraq. Casualties weren't as high. But the point is, when you've got certain group of people who serve reflexively in the military, and then there's a certain group of people who don't, you're going to see the world differently. And when you see the world differently, it's almost like one side being Shia Muslims and one side being Sunni. There's no difference in those people. There's no biological difference or racial difference. It's just how you happen to be raised. And yet you have this extraordinary antipathy between the groups, at least suspicion. And I think there's a great danger when we allow that to be that way. And so I'm a great believer in a military draft. You know, people say, well, we don't want draftees because they don't. I think we want America evenly represented. Every zip code should be at risk when you go to war. And I think we would be stronger at the end of the day. What we don't want is anything approaching a foreign legion where you can deploy it because you know nobody in your family is at risk.
Yeah, I mean, this is a counterfactual, but if there had been a draft during the Iraq War, I think the surge would have been a much harder sell, right? Because you have the all-volunteer military, they just saluted and went along with it. Because at that time, the American people had completely turned against the war, more or less.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And on the one hand, you say, well, boy, that makes us a weaker country because we don't have the ability to deploy forces when we need, and you are dependent upon popular support. But ultimately, we're dependent upon popular support no matter what. And so maybe what it really would have done is make leaders do harder work trying to convince people what we need to do. I'm a believer, actually, that the War Powers Act and the power of the presidency has grown too much in terms of going to war. And it's not because, you know, if I was president, I'd want unfettered power. Anybody would. But the bottom line is, if you don't have to make that argument, if you don't have to convince people, maybe the argument's not that strong.
Well, we have a very current example of this, which is the conflation of narco and terrorists, which we've now, I think, had strike number 8, which is extended beyond Venezuelan boats now to Colombian boats. And we've had 2 survivors. JSOC would have been, when you were, they would have been implementing a lot of these operations. What do you think of them?
I think it's very dangerous. Now, the military has capabilities that sometimes are appropriate, that need to be used in certain situations. But the reality is, I think it's a slippery slope. As soon as you have the military doing law enforcement, several things are going to happen. First is, what happens in law enforcement in the drug-related world? Unless we are immune from what other countries find, corruption follows, because there is unlimited money to go in, and you start this potential for people coming to an Army officer or any service member and saying, we don't want you to see this boat going over this thing. And the person says, I don't do anything. They said, we're going to give you $20,000 not to see it. And you say, well, I don't take money. Well, we're going to kill your kids. And then suddenly it's a different, but that's real. That happens. And so once you put the military in that, you have the potential. We say, well, we've got a very honest military. We do, but we haven't been in that situation. I have never taken a bribe in my entire life. I've never been offered one. So we don't really know yet, do we? But this is important. And so when you start to move in that direction, I think the danger is that you get into things that we're not prepared and set up for, and laws aren't, fully fleshed out for.
You wrote another book, Team of Teams. I think you wrote it with Chris Fussell, who's a New America Fellow. One of the very interesting things about the book is what you say about leadership and the kind of teams that you reflect on the question of hiring superstars or not superstars, or how you build a team that's effective.
Yeah, we had an experience in JSOC, and that experience was different from what we expected. The hierarchical top-down leadership was not appropriate, didn't work for that environment, although we wanted to make it work. And we found out that if we didn't, we had to change to a much more collaborative, much more decentralized, allowing autonomy at different levels, which meant leaders had to fundamentally change the way they thought about it, and they focused, and the relationship between leaders and followers. Now, special operations forces, people say, well, they're special, so it doesn't apply. The reality is, what I found is it applies in every organization. There is a different way of functioning in today's complex information technology rich environment. And you got to think about it differently, and you got to approach it differently, and you got to sort of squelch that desire to be the chess master who micromanages.
You have an interesting, at Yale, you ask some of your students to write their own obituaries. What does that produce?
Yeah, at first they wondered why I write my obituary. I say, because you screw this up. But no. Think about it. If you really have to think about what your full summation of your life is going to be, you start to think, well, wait a minute, how do I conduct myself to get to that endpoint? And I don't think most of us do that. I didn't do that nearly well enough. I didn't think about, what person do I want to be? I never thought I'd survive after the military, so I never thought about getting old. And now I have, and I care. I don't care what everybody thinks of me, but there's a small group of people I really care. My granddaughters, they're 11, 8, and 5, and they live next door to me. I see them every day. What they think of me is just incredibly important. And later in life, when they read and hear about things, I want them to triangulate, well, I knew Granddaddy. And I want them to be able to judge. So I think the obituary is a reminder to young people, there is going to be that moment.
Yeah. I went to a high school, and somebody asked the headmaster, what are you preparing your students for? He said, we're preparing them for death, which is, I think it's a pretty powerful. It's not a way people think very much anymore, but I think it's a useful way of thinking things. Let me ask you about our current environment. So we have a Secretary of War or Defense, or however you want to. I mean, what do you make of him?
Yeah, I don't think he was prepared for the job. And I think that his metric of success is pleasing his boss. And so I think that that's a dynamic that, you always want to please your boss. But the reality is we hire for big jobs, we hire strong people because they aren't dependent upon that constant approval. You've got to have people in important jobs to be able to look up at the boss and go, no, that's not the way we do it, and whatnot. So if anything, I think it's a missed opportunity. I bear the secretary no ill will, but if we think about bringing 800 generals in recently to Quantico, and he gave a speech that everybody expected him to give, and people who loved him loved it, and people who hated him hated it. What if he'd gotten up in front of everybody and given a very out of character, very thoughtful analysis of the world and said, here's what we're going to have to do in the War Department going forward. We're going to have to do more of this, less of this. He did some of that. But what if he'd come across like a Peter Bergen and done that? Everybody would have done a reset. They'd go, whoa, what just happened? Here's somebody who has really thought this through. When we play to stereotype, I think we miss an opportunity, particularly as different as that particular one. So, I mean, there's hope.
You famously eat one meal a day. Why is that?
Yeah.
And also because I wasn't entirely sure it was true until I read this book, because you never really kind of confirmed it before in writing, I don't think.
Yeah, I eat dinner only. I got home from New York City at 9:30 last night, so I hadn't eaten. There were, marks on my forearm where I was chewing it. But I thought I was getting fat when I was a young officer, and I don't have the discipline to eat small meals. So I just found it was easier for me not to eat anything until dinner and then eat what I want. But it's interesting, if you watch on YouTube, I am now popular, not me personally, but intermittent fasting. I was ahead of my time. Now I'll come back around where I'll be proven it's medically, disastrous. But I'm 71 and, I've been doing it for almost 50 years. If I change suddenly, it could kill me. So.
Well, I would like to open it to the audience. If you have a question, can you raise your hand and identify yourself? And Anne-Marie, the boss here, has the right of first question. Is there a mic that we can give her? Thank you.
General McChrystal, I have to say that before I ever met you, the first thing I ever heard about you was from Les Gelb when he was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and you were a fellow. And the thing I remember was him saying, and Stan McChrystal doesn't have an ounce of body fat anywhere on his body. That was a source of real amazement. You were running every day. I didn't know that it was only one meal a day, but it made an impression. And the other thing I do want to just say is I teach Team of Teams and I've relied on it. But the thing that always surprises my students is that you define leadership as gardening. And people always say, wait a minute, General McChrystal, that McChrystal? I'm like, yes. And it always shocks people to hear that somebody in such a hierarchical organization thinks about cultivating relationships and empowering people. But my question is about character. And you said you want to start a national conversation, which we badly need. I'd love to hear more about how, because I know you've supported a national service, tried to bring one about. That doesn't look like it's on the horizon at the federal level, maybe the states. But I'd just like to hear how you think this book will help, but what do you hope will happen?
Yeah, it's a great one, Emery, because the disappointing answer is I'm not sure. I've been doing this. We came out with a book in May. And I've been going around to presidential libraries and different places and giving talks to groups like this. As I was telling Anne-Marie, the danger is people who come to here are typically people who already think about character. What I want is I want people to watch TV. This is the result, not the how. watch TV and see a politician, for example, looking at the TV lying to you. And right now they look and they lie at you. They know you know it's a lie. And yet we don't do anything about it. We go, well, they're a politician, so that's what they got to do, and it's okay. It's not okay. And I think we've got to get to a point where we say there are some norms. You don't want tightly corseted norms like religious limitations of this and that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about norms about how we treat people, norms about how we think about citizenship, norms about what we think about integrity. And I think it's almost got to be emerging at a Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club kind of level, where people make a commitment. I am going to join this compact not to be a person without character. And literally make it something that you are proud of and you commit to publicly so that people see that. What if every member of Congress literally stood in front of the American people? I promise not to lie to you. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? But I think it's going to have to be something like that. But I don't have the magic lever to do it. I wish I told Peter I wanted a Taliban-like, revival, and that analogy doesn't work well, really.
This gentleman here.
General, hi, my name's Paul Tennant. I'm former British Army. I'd love to ask you, if I may, about a bit of a crisis we're going through in the British military at the moment, and the perception, I think, well-founded, including in special forces, of being deserted by British politicians going back 30 years for things that they've done. And I know you're familiar with the conversation. And I just invite you to connect it to the business of service and this alarming sort of trend towards a sort of warrior caste who follow their parents or their uncles into uniform. How do you think you can connect what you would teach about character to inform specifically that conversation?
No, thanks so much, and thanks for your service. What he's referring to is particularly the British Army now. If you go back to the Special Air Service and others in Northern Ireland have been brought under huge scrutiny again, and some actual legal issues, and then same sort of thing, scrutiny about things that were done or not done on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, my view first is that just because you're military, you don't get a pass. You don't get to do whatever you want. You don't get to kill, murder, torture, all that kind of stuff. And we know that. And discipline in military forces is designed to guarantee that. That's the difference. It's not just morality. It's the fact that you've got a disciplined system. At the same time, people who go and they serve in a way that they believe is how they were taught and they're following rules, they have to have a level of protection from the population and from opportunists, in some cases press, some cases politicians, others who want to use them as piñatas later because they've got this axe they want to grind. Because what happens over time is you won't get people to serve, particularly for the very difficult tasks. There are some things in the counterterrorist fight that were pretty ugly. I will tell you, pretty ugly, that you would have been shocked to see and be a part of. Not that we were doing that we were wrong, but just the nature of that fight. And that's always the case. And so there has got to be an acceptance that when a nation sends its service members somewhere, it can expect from them discipline to the law of armed conflict, discipline to the values and all that they are given, but protection for all the things they do within those boundaries. And I think that needs to be more in Britain right now. I think that needs to be more energetic on the part of people who are supporting.
General, can I ask you about that specific issue? You showed the Battle of Algiers, which, for anybody who may recall, is sort of almost a documentary-like film about the French in Algeria, to your team. Why did you do that?
It was very early in the war, February of 2004, And we had just about a month before figured out how ugly this was going to be and how long it was going to go. So I got all my commanders together. I brought an author in who had written about the French in Indochina, and we showed the Battle of Algiers. And I showed it to him because I said, this is what we're about to run into. We're about to be an extended, complicated fight that is going to test us militarily and morally, and it's going to be something that we are going to have to rise to the occasion. In that particular case, of course, the French paratroopers in Algiers, the city, used torture to break the FLN leadership. Now, the truth is, it works. The torture gets them what they need, and the paratroopers win a tactical victory there. But it morally corrodes the force. It corrodes the force, and you could argue the effort of the nation. And so what I was trying to do is get my leaders ready for the fact that this is not going to be simple. And we are going to have to navigate this, and it's something that's going to be around every single day.
A question from this gentleman?
Yeah. So, General, you may not recognize the beard, but I was General Caldwell's CAG chief back when you were there. And so Mark Hagerott, former naval officer, former CAG chief. I still remember the most memorable dinner you brought me over when we were with the superintendent of the Afghan Academy, if you remember, around your table. And it was a generational thing. You brought him out of retirement. He was in his 70s. I remember him saying, if we can just hold long enough, the young people will take over. But the question I had was, serendipitously, I was also in Wolfowitz Rumsfeld's office when things began to unravel. I was having like flashbacks, what you talk about, just the stunning look of what was happening. Right now, I'm working on a book, which has been long making, called Commanding Minds and Machines, about the evolution of the Naval Officer Corps. And I've come across the fact that 4 of the 6 Joint Chiefs were Naval Academy graduates, heavy technology, technocentric. Rumsfeld's a naval officer. Larry DeRita's a naval officer. Bill Luty's a naval officer. I'm a naval officer. It was about 10 Navy all around, the Air Force. And here's the Army trying to explain through Shinseki, we have to have a bigger occupation force, which I think literally was the first mistake. Do you have any comments on how do we get to the point where we actually thought we could go into Iraq, a country the size of California, and do what we did? Because I think that laid the groundwork for everything you described. So any thoughts on that decision?
I think it was hubris. And for those of you who remember, Secretary Rumsfeld was a powerful personality. And in some ways, he was right. He came in and just smashed the military bureaucracy. And at one point, I was in a meeting with all of the 4 stars, and they're saying, we have to follow what's called the TIP-FID. And that is, give some of you nightmares. That's a time-phased deployment plan to how you're going to flow forces to a war. And it's done with computers and takes a long time to put it together. And when it was time to do this, the military told Rumsfeld, if we invade Iraq, we've got to execute the TIP-FID. And it's going to flow all these forces. And Rumsfeld goes, no, we don't. And I remember they go, yeah, we do. We really do. Boom, boom. And then I'm back in the next Saturday morning meeting. I'm the vice J3 at that point. And the 4 stars get with the chairman in there and they go, he just doesn't understand. You got to go in and tell him, we have got to do the TIP-FID, this bullshit, boom, boom. So they kind of screw up General Meyer, wind him up, and they send him in. The chairman just stuffs him. We are not doing the TIP-FID. The secretary was right. We were filling a stereotype of military that's got to follow this plan, boom, boom, boom. We can't do anything. But then the idea was we could drive into Iraq, we could overthrow the government, we could take the keys, give it to a new government, we could drive out, and it was going to be fine. And that was lunacy. We knew better in the moment. There were volumes written about the relationships between Sunni, Shia, Kurds, and whatnot, and the complexities of the tribes. It was all knowable. It wasn't like we suddenly discovered it. And so there was this hubris that if we go in and do this with this extraordinarily competent, professional, highly mechanized force, that will serve us well. Because remember, 1991, when we crushed Saddam Hussein's army, it really looked kind of easy. And so this time we go do. And so The Army's doing math. I mean, that's what we do. We're not that smart. And they literally just did math. How many square miles? How many people? We're going to need a lot more force. And it was obvious. But people just said, nope, this is different. It's kind of like the stock market. You have a bubble, and then somebody goes, well, this time it's different. All right.
Hey,
Air Force undermined the Army was kind of the question since they dominated.
Well, I think not intentionally. I don't think it was them trying to do an evil thing. I think it was them trying to meet Rumsfeld's desires. They wanted to do what he wanted done, and it fit really well with their, shock and awe. We'll do it by machines. And of course, we knew it wouldn't work.
General McChrystal, I just one really quick final question. Anne-Marie has written a lot about this, and we have a program that looks at this question. And you have a lot to say about work-life, family balance, and how you were as a father.
Yeah, Anne-Marie wrote the most popular, I think, thing ever written about you can't have it all. And I think that's right. This work-life balance thing, I think work-life balance is over the sweep of a lifetime. If you look at, great athletes, you look at great leaders in business or whatever, for the period they are trying to do that, they work their butts off. They do not have balance. And you're never going to have balance when you're doing that. And you shouldn't try to pretend that you will, and you shouldn't feel guilty when you don't. But over the sweep of your lifetime, you have the opportunity to do more certain periods in life. Some people are never going to get work-life balance. They choose not to. And yet we throw a guilt trip on them now. People, they tell me I'm still full-time and everything running my company. You should quit. You're abusing Annie. I haven't heard it from Annie. She didn't say, hang around more. The point is, society gets changed by people who work their ass off. Just the deal. And the reality is, if everybody in our society had great work-life balance, we wouldn't be a more successful society. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that work-life balance for you, particularly during parts of your life, isn't the right idea. So I'm not, I'm just saying that as soon as we say that the only approach is work-life balance, I think we're being unrealistic.
I want to thank the general want to thank the general who's very kindly agreed to sign some of his books. Thank you very much, sir.